The throne room of the Selenar Empire was designed to inspire awe, and it succeeded spectacularly. Captain David Reeves stood at the designated position for honored guests, trying to maintain the formal composure expected at such ceremonies, while also managing the underlying nervousness of someone who'd been coached for 3 days on proper protocol, and still wasn't confident he'd remember all of it. The room was massive, with architecture that combined function and beauty in ways human design rarely achieved. High ceilings adorned with luminescent patterns that shifted slowly, creating ambient light that felt natural despite being entirely artificial. Hundreds of Selenar nobles and officials filled the observation galleries, their formal attire creating a sea of elegant clothing in deep blues and silvers. At the front of the chamber, human diplomatic representatives sat in their designated section, looking appropriately formal and probably calculating the political implications of everything happening. At the center of it all, elevated on a throne that was somehow both elegant and imposing, sat Queen Ashira. David had met her 3 weeks ago during the crisis that had brought him here, a catastrophic mining accident on a Selenar colony that had threatened thousands of lives. He'd been commanding a human vessel, conducting routine patrol nearby when the distress signal came through. Standard protocol would have been to report the situation and wait for official diplomatic clearance before intervening in Selenar space. David had judged that by the time clearance came through, everyone on that colony would be dead. He'd violated protocol, crossed into Selenar territory without authorization, and coordinated a rescue operation that had saved most of the colony's population. It had been the right call operationally, though he'd expected it might end his career through diplomatic complications. Instead, he'd been formally invited to the Selenar homeworld to be honored for his actions. And during the subsequent 3 weeks of debriefings, coordination meetings, and diplomatic functions, he'd gotten to know Queen Ashira beyond the formal public persona she projected. Now, watching her preside over this ceremony with perfect regal composure, David was struck again by the difference between the public queen and the person he'd glimpsed in private moments. She was beautiful. That was obvious to anyone who looked at her. The Selenar had humanoid features enough that cross-species aesthetic appreciation was common, though they were clearly alien. Ashira's luminescent markings traced elegant patterns along her skin, visible even beneath the elaborate formal robes she wore. Her ears were pointed and mobile in ways that conveyed emotion to those who knew how to read them. Her eyes were larger than human eyes, deep blue with an intensity that made direct eye contact feel significant. But beyond the physical beauty, David had seen her intelligence during strategy discussions, her dedication to her people during crisis management, her dry sense of humor during brief moments when formality dropped. He'd found himself increasingly drawn to her, which was both inconvenient and completely inappropriate given their respective positions. The formal ceremony proceeded through elaborate steps. Queen Ashira's primary advisor, Lady Saris, read the official recognition of David's service, detailing how his actions had saved thousands of Selenar lives and demonstrated the best values of the Human-Selenar Alliance. Representatives from both governments made appropriate speeches. David was called forward to receive formal recognition, approaching the throne using the specific number of steps he'd been coached to take, bowing at the correct depth, maintaining the proper distance. Queen Ashira addressed him in the formal Selenar language, her words being simultaneously translated for the human delegation. Captain David Reeves, your courage and decisive action in the face of crisis saved the lives of thousands of our people. You acted without thought for your own safety or career, prioritizing our citizens above diplomatic convenience. The Selenar Empire recognizes this selfless service and the debt of honor we owe you. She paused, and the room went silent in anticipation of what tradition dictated would come next. According to our customs, one who saves lives on such a scale is owed a debt that must be repaid. We offer you the traditional reward for such service, the right to choose any unmarried woman in the Selenar Empire as a partner, should you desire to form a union. It was clearly meant to be ceremonial. David had been briefed on this tradition, had been told that the appropriate response was either to gracefully decline, or, if he wanted to make a politically advantageous choice, to select from a pre-approved list of Selenar nobility who'd been identified as suitable candidates. The human diplomatic corps had even provided him with names and backgrounds of several women who would welcome such an arrangement for its political advantages. David looked at Queen Ashira, sitting on her throne in all her regal formality, and made a decision that was going to either be the most romantic gesture or the most catastrophic diplomatic breach of his career. "Then I choose you, Your Majesty." The silence that followed was absolute. Not a single person in the throne room moved. Even Queen Ashira froze, her luminescent markings cycling rapidly through colors that David's limited knowledge of Selenar physiology suggested indicated shock and intense emotional response. David had just broken approximately 17 protocols by addressing the Queen so directly, by treating the formal offer as if it could apply to her, by essentially declaring his personal interest in front of her entire court and diplomatic representatives from multiple worlds. Lady Saris recovered first, moving to intervene. "Captain Reeves, I believe there's been a misunderstanding of Selenar customs. The Queen's offer naturally doesn't include—" "Silence." Queen Ashira's voice was quiet but carried absolute authority. Her markings had settled into colors David couldn't interpret, her expression unreadable behind the formal mask she wore. "I will address this matter myself." She looked at David for a long moment, and he couldn't tell if her gaze was angry, shocked, or something else entirely. When she spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. "Captain Reeves, do you understand what you just said? Do you comprehend the implications of such a statement?" "I understand it was inappropriate, Your Majesty. I understand it violated protocols and was disrespectful to your position." David kept his voice steady despite his awareness that hundreds of people were watching this disaster unfold. "But I also understand the question you asked, and I answered honestly. I choose you." The markings shifted again, more colors David didn't know, emotional states he couldn't read. Queen Ashira stood from her throne, which apparently was significant because several court officials made startled sounds. She descended the stairs slowly, coming to stand directly in front of David at his level, another protocol break based on the reactions from her court. "You realize," she said quietly just for him, "that what you've said is either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, and I'm not yet certain which." "Probably both, Your Majesty." Something flickered in her expression. Was that amusement? But it was gone before David could be certain. She turned to address the assembled court, her voice returning to formal register. "This ceremony is concluded. All persons will depart except Captain Reeves and my personal guard. I will address his unprecedented request in private." The court erupted in whispered conversations as people filed out, clearly shocked that a formal ceremony had been cut short. The human diplomatic delegation looked like they wanted to intervene, but didn't dare. David's commanding officer shot him a look that promised a very unpleasant conversation later. Within minutes, the vast throne room was empty except for David, Queen Ashira, and 4 guards stationed at distant positions around the chamber. The Queen stood studying him, her markings still shifting through colors he desperately wished he could interpret. "Explain yourself," she said finally, "and be honest because I will know if you're not." David took a breath. He was already committed to this disaster, might as well see it through. "During the rescue operation 3 weeks ago, and in the meetings since, I've seen past the formal distance you maintain. I've seen the person beneath the crown, someone brilliant, dedicated, bearing immense responsibility largely alone. Someone who shows flashes of humor when formality briefly drops, who makes strategic decisions I admire, who cares deeply about her people. These are observations about my capabilities as a ruler. They don't explain your statement. I'm attracted to you, Your Majesty, intellectually, professionally, and personally. I've been unable to think about anyone else since I met you." He met her eyes directly, another protocol break. "I understand that saying so is inappropriate. I understand the complications my position creates. But when you offered me the choice, I couldn't let the moment pass without being honest about what I actually want." Queen Ashira was silent for a long time, her markings cycling through what he thought might be conflict between different emotions. When she spoke, her voice had lost some of its formal edge. "Do you know how long it's been since anyone spoke to me with such direct honesty? Since anyone saw me as Ashira the person rather than the queen?" She paused. "I'm not certain if I'm flattered or offended by your presumption. Possibly both. I apologize for any offense, Your Majesty. That wasn't my intention." "Your intention was to declare your personal interest in me in front of my entire court and multiple diplomatic delegations. That cannot be walked back or ignored." Her expression was difficult to read. "You have created an impossible situation, Captain Reeves. I am a queen. I cannot simply accept personal advances from a human naval officer, regardless of my own feelings on the matter." David's heart jumped at that last phrase. "You have feelings on the matter." "I didn't say that." "You implied it." "I implied nothing. I stated that your situation is impossible." But her markings shifted to colors that might have been gold, warmth, pleasure, before she controlled them back to neutral tones. "I require time to consider how to address your unprecedented request. Return to your quarters. You'll be summoned when I've reached a decision." "Your Majesty, That is not a request, Captain. It is a command from your queen. Go." David bowed formally and departed, escorted by guards who seemed uncertain whether to treat him as an honored guest or a potential threat to their queen's dignity. As he walked through the palace corridors toward his assigned quarters, he reflected that he'd either just ruined human Selenar diplomatic relations or started something that would change both their lives. Possibly both. Definitely both. He was in so much trouble. David's quarters in the palace were luxurious by any standard, but they felt like a gilded cage as he waited for Queen Ashira's decision. He'd been there for 6 hours when the secure communication system activated with a priority call from his commanding officer, Admiral Chen. "Reeves, what the hell were you thinking?" Chen's face on the screen looked tired and furious. "I just spent 3 hours in emergency diplomatic consultations, trying to explain why one of my officers decided to publicly declare his interest in an alien monarch. Please tell me you have a better explanation than temporary insanity." "I meant what I said, Admiral. I understand the complications." "Complications? That's your word for potentially destroying the diplomatic relationship we've spent a decade carefully building." Chen ran his hand over his face. "The Selenar diplomatic corps is confused. Our diplomatic corps is horrified. And I have 17 different departments demanding explanations I don't have." "I'm sorry for the complications, sir, but I'm not sorry for what I said." Chen stared at him through the screen. "You're serious? You actually meant it?" "Yes, sir. Reeves, she's a queen. She's alien. She's the absolute ruler of an empire. What made you think this was remotely appropriate?" David tried to find words for something he didn't fully understand himself. "During the rescue operation and the meeting since, I've got to know her beyond the formal role. She's brilliant, dedicated, funny when formality drops. I've been increasingly drawn to her, and when she made the formal offer, I couldn't let the moment pass without being honest about what I actually want." "What you want is irrelevant compared to diplomatic stability." "With respect, sir, maybe that's the problem. Maybe we've been so focused on diplomatic stability that we forget actual people are involved in these relationships." David knew he was probably ending his career but continued anyway. "I made a choice to be honest. If that ruins my career or complicates diplomatic relations, I accept those consequences, but I don't regret the honesty. Chen looked at him for a long moment. You're either the bravest officer I've ever commanded or the stupidest, possibly both. You're confined to quarters pending Queen Ashira's decision on how to proceed. And Reeves, whatever happens, your career as you knew it is over. This either works out in some unprecedented way, or you're looking at early retirement. After the call ended, David found himself pacing his quarters, replaying the throne room conversation and wondering what Queen Ashira was thinking. He got his answer 3 hours later when Lady Saris appeared at his door. Captain Reeves, Her Majesty requests your presence in the private gardens, immediately. David followed Saris through palace corridors he hadn't seen before, deeper into private sections where formality gave way to more comfortable spaces. The gardens were beautiful, carefully maintained plants from multiple Selenar worlds, water features that created soothing sounds, lighting that mimicked their home star. Queen Ashira was waiting near a fountain, and David's breath caught at seeing her. She wasn't wearing her formal regalia. Instead, she wore simpler clothing that Selenar wore in private, her luminescent markings more visible without elaborate robes concealing them. Her hair was down rather than formally styled, and the overall effect was of someone choosing to appear as a person rather than a symbol. Captain Reeves. She dismissed Saris with a gesture, leaving them alone. I wanted to speak with you away from formal settings and observing courts. What you said today cannot be unsaid. We must address it honestly. I understand, Your Majesty. Please stop calling me that in private. My name is Ashira. She gestured for him to sit on a bench near the fountain. Tell me what you were thinking. Help me understand why you would make such a statement when you must have known the complications it would create. David sat, leaving appropriate distance between them. During the rescue operation, I made a tactical decision to violate protocol because following proper procedures would have meant everyone died. You thanked me afterward by saying sometimes the right action requires ignoring what we're supposed to do in favor of what we know needs doing. I remember. This felt similar. The proper protocol was to decline your offer or choose from an approved list, but the honest action was to tell you what I actually felt. He looked at her directly. In the meeting since the rescue, I've seen past the formal distance you maintain. I've seen someone intelligent, dedicated, bearing immense weight with grace. Someone who shows flashes of humor and genuine personality when formality briefly drops. I've been drawn to you, and I couldn't let the moment pass without being honest about that. Ashira's markings shifted to colors David didn't recognize, cycling through what seemed like complex emotional responses. Do you know how many people interact with me daily? Hundreds. Advisors, nobles, supplicants, diplomatic representatives. And do you know how many of them see me as anything other than a symbol, a political entity to negotiate with? She paused. None. No one speaks to me as a woman. No one treats me as a person with desires and feelings. I am the queen, and that is all anyone sees. That seems lonely. It is the cost of power. I accepted it when I took the throne 15 years ago. Her voice carried weight of those years. But then you arrived and somehow saw past what everyone else sees. You speak to me with direct honesty. You challenge my thinking in strategy meetings. You made me laugh during a diplomatic function where I'm supposed to maintain perfect formal composure. David felt his heart rate accelerate. You noticed that? I notice everything, Captain. It's necessary for survival in my position. Her markings shifted to what might have been warm colors, golds and soft oranges. I've been aware of you, of your presence, your perspective, the way you see problems differently from how Selenar approach them. I've found excuses to include you in meetings that didn't strictly require your attendance. So you've been interested. I didn't allow myself to think of it in those terms. I am a queen. Personal interest is a distraction I cannot afford. She looked at him directly. But yes, I've been attracted to your intelligence, your courage, your honesty. And that makes your public statement both wonderful and terrible. Terrible how? Wonderful because someone finally saw me as more than a crown and was brave enough to say so. Terrible because it forces me to confront desires I've suppressed for years, and because actually pursuing anything between us would create complications that could damage both our people's interests. Her expression showed conflict. I'm attracted to you, David, but I am also a queen with responsibilities that extend far beyond personal desires. They talked for hours in the gardens, the conversation becoming more personal than either had intended. David learned about the weight of ascending to power young, the loneliness of holding absolute authority, the way Ashira had suppressed personal desires for 15 years in service of her people. She learned about his own path to command, the reasons he'd chosen military service, the way his focus on career had meant his personal life remained mostly empty. By the time the Selenar moons rose, casting the gardens in silvery light, they'd acknowledged mutual attraction but faced the impossible reality of their positions. I cannot accept your request formally, Ashira said finally. The political complications are too severe. My position won't allow it. David felt disappointment settle in his chest but nodded. I understand. However, she stood and David stood with her. I'm not willing to completely dismiss what we've acknowledged here. I propose an alternative. You accept no, but it's also not rejection. Her markings showed determination. It's me choosing to explore possibility despite complications, to see if honesty and attraction can survive in the reality of our different positions and responsibilities. David considered this carefully. It wasn't what he'd hoped for when he made his statement in the throne room, but it was considerably better than complete dismissal. I accept your offer, Your Majesty, Ashira. Thank you for considering this, instead of simply rejecting the situation entirely. Thank you for being brave enough to speak honestly, even when doing so was inappropriate. She smiled, and it transformed her face from regal formality to genuine warmth. I don't know where this leads, but I'm willing to find out. As David returned to his quarters, escorted by guards who seemed less uncertain about his status now, he reflected that his career as a simple naval officer was definitely over. But something else was beginning, something unprecedented and complicated and possibly worth every risk he'd taken. Tomorrow he'd start his new position as cultural liaison. And more importantly, tomorrow he'd continue discovering whether the connection he'd felt with a queen could become something real. The position of cultural liaison turned out to involve considerably more work than David had anticipated. He was essentially learning to navigate Selenar court politics, diplomatic protocols, and cultural nuances that usually took years for outsiders to understand. But it also meant regular, advisory meetings with Queen Ashira that were officially about cultural exchange and cooperation, but increasingly became opportunities for genuine personal conversation. Over the following months, they developed a careful relationship within the constraints of her position. They couldn't be seen as too familiar in public. That would feed gossip and political opposition. But in private advisory meetings, in walks through the palace gardens, in late-night strategy sessions that were ostensibly about diplomatic matters, they built something real. David learned more about the person beneath the crown. Ashira loved mathematics and strategic games, found most courtly entertainment tedious, had a dry sense of humor that emerged when formality dropped. She was brilliant at reading political situations, but confessed to being terrible at small talk, which made many diplomatic functions exhausting performances. She'd sacrificed personal relationships entirely to consolidate power after ascending young, and the loneliness of that choice had been weighing on her for years. Ashira learned about David's background. Growing up on a frontier colony, joining the military to see the universe beyond his homeworld, the way he approached leadership by trusting his subordinates rather than micromanaging. She was fascinated by human combat doctrine, which she viewed as simultaneously chaotic and ingeniously adaptive. She enjoyed his perspectives on problems because they came from completely different cultural frameworks than what her Selenar advisors provided. They were building genuine partnership, but always within careful boundaries. They didn't discuss what they were building or where it might lead. That felt too dangerous, too likely to force decisions neither was ready to make. The complications became unavoidable when a faction of Selenar nobles decided to challenge Queen Ashira's authority. It had been brewing for months, opposition to her rule by traditionalists who viewed her as too young, too willing to work with other species, too unconcerned with maintaining Selenar superiority. They'd been looking for an opening to question her fitness to rule. David's presence gave them that opening. The accusations came during a session of the High Council, the governing body that could technically remove a queen if her rule was deemed detrimental to the empire. A senior noble named Lord Keseth stood and formally questioned Queen Ashira's judgment. "Your Majesty has granted unprecedented access to a human officer. This Captain Reeves attends private meetings, is present at diplomatic functions, has the Queen's ear on matters of state policy. And all of this despite having made a highly inappropriate personal declaration that should have resulted in his immediate dismissal. Captain Reeves serves as cultural liaison," Ashira responded with cold formality. "His perspective on human Selenar cooperation has been valuable to our diplomatic efforts." His perspective, or his presence. Keseth's tone was pointed. The entire court knows he made an inappropriate personal request. Your Majesty's decision to keep him at court, despite this, suggests poor judgment at best, inappropriate attachment at worst. David, watching from the gallery where non-council members observed proceedings, felt his stomach drop. They were attacking Ashira using him as a weapon, questioning her fitness to rule because she hadn't dismissed him after his statement in the throne room. The debate continued for hours, with Keseth and his allies arguing that Ashira's relationship with David. They carefully never called it a relationship, but the implication was clear, demonstrated compromised judgment. That a queen who couldn't maintain appropriate distance from a human who declared personal interest was unfit to rule. Ashira defended herself with the political skill that had kept her in power for 15 years, but David could see the situation was deteriorating. The opposition was using procedural tactics to force a vote on her fitness to rule, and while they probably didn't have the votes to succeed, the political damage was severe. That evening, after the council session concluded without resolution, David made a decision. He requested a private meeting with Queen Ashira and told her he was going to request transfer back to human space. "If I'm the excuse they're using to question your authority, removing me from the equation eliminates their ammunition. You'll be able to." "No," Ashira's voice was flat, absolute. "But they're using me against you. They're using my personal life against me because they can't attack my actual governance. If I let them force me to dismiss you, I'm admitting that they control what personal choices I'm allowed to make." Her markings showed determination mixed with what might have been anger. "I won't do it. Ashira, this is destroying your political position. Then I'll rebuild my political position, but I won't sacrifice you to political convenience." She moved closer, dropping the formal distance she usually maintained. "David, these months working with you, getting to know you, building this connection, it's been the first time in 15 years I've felt like something other than just a crown. I'm not giving that up because some traditionalist nobles are uncomfortable with change." Before David could respond, they received word that Keseth's faction had scheduled an emergency council session for the next day, planning to force an immediate vote on Queen Ashira's fitness to rule. It was a direct challenge to her authority, essentially a bloodless coup built on legal technicalities. The next day's council session was packed, with observers from across the Selenar Empire present to witness whether their queen could survive this challenge. David watched from the gallery as Keseth presented his motion, arguing that Queen Ashira's judgment was compromised, that her attachment to a human officer demonstrated unfitness to rule. Ashira let them speak, let them build their case, her expression unreadable behind formal composure. Then she stood to respond, and David saw the queen who'd held power through intelligence and will rather than just inherited authority. She systematically dismantled every argument against her, pointed out that her governance record was exemplary, economic growth, diplomatic success, military strength, all measurable improvements during her rule, demonstrated that Keseth's faction had their own corruption and conflicts of interest that motivated their challenge, made clear that their actual objection wasn't to David specifically, but to any queen strong enough to resist their manipulation. Then she addressed the personal accusations directly, and her voice rang with authority that silenced the entire chamber. Yes, Captain Reeves made a personal declaration. Yes, I have developed personal regard for him. And if my enemies wish to use that as grounds for removal, they should understand something. I am a queen, but I am also a person. I have governed for 15 years without allowing personal relationships to compromise my duty to our people. My effectiveness as a ruler is demonstrated by measurable results, not by how well I conform to outdated expectations about royal isolation. She turned to address the full council. If you vote to remove me because I'm human enough to have feelings while still performing my duties excellently, then you're not protecting the empire. You're attacking me for refusing to be the emotionless symbol you're comfortable with. And I will not apologize for being both an effective ruler and an actual person with actual feelings. The silence that followed was absolute. Then one council member stood and spoke in support of the queen, then another. The momentum shifted as more council members recognized that attacking Ashira for having personal feelings while still ruling effectively was a losing argument. The vote, when it came, rejected Keseth's motion decisively. His attempted coup collapsed, and several of his allies quietly distanced themselves in the aftermath. Later, in Ashira's private chambers after the crisis had passed, she sat with visible exhaustion while David processed what had happened. She'd publicly acknowledged their connection, not explicitly stating it was a relationship, but making clear she had personal regard for him and wouldn't apologize for it. "You just made our connection public," David said. "I made my refusal to be ashamed of it public. There's a difference." She looked at him directly. "I couldn't let you leave, couldn't pretend that what we've built doesn't matter. My enemies forced me to choose between political convenience and honesty. And I chose honesty because that's what you taught me by making your impossible request in the first place. I never meant to make your position harder. You didn't. You gave me permission to be something other than just a crown. To remember that being a good ruler doesn't require sacrificing every personal desire." She smiled, tired but genuine. "Though I admit this complicates things significantly. What happens now? Now we stop pretending this doesn't exist. We still have no clear path forward, but we're done hiding that there's something to find a path toward." David moved to sit beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, a simple gesture that felt revolutionary given the careful distance they'd maintained for months. "We'll figure it out." "Yes," Ashira agreed, "together." Following the council challenge, the political landscape shifted fundamentally. Queen Ashira had publicly acknowledged personal regard for David, which meant the relationship could no longer exist in ambiguous space. It had to be addressed formally, which created an entirely new set of complications. Selenar protocols around royal partnerships were elaborate and inflexible, built for relationships between Selenar nobility, not cross-species partnerships with humans who had completely different backgrounds and cultural frameworks. The High Council, while unable to remove Ashira for having personal feelings, could still block any formal partnership that didn't meet specific criteria. Lady Saris, who'd been watching this relationship develop with increasing concern and grudging respect, proposed a solution. The law requires that royal consorts demonstrate understanding of Selenar governance and cultural practices. Captain Reeves technically meets no eligibility requirements except proven capability, which your advisors grudgingly admit he possesses. She paused. However, if he were to undergo formal training in Selenar law, governance, and cultural practices, and successfully demonstrate competence, the council could be persuaded to approve him as a candidate. You're suggesting I put him through years of education to satisfy legal requirements. Ashira's tone was skeptical. I'm suggesting a compressed version, 12 months of intensive training that covers what Selenar nobility learn over their lifetimes. It's not ideal, but it provides a path forward that respects our protocols while acknowledging the unique situation. David accepted the challenge immediately. The following year became an intensive education in Selenar history, law, political theory, and cultural practices. He was essentially attending a diplomatic and governance academy compressed into 12 months, while also continuing his duties as cultural liaison and managing his relationship with Ashira. It was exhausting. Selenar legal frameworks were complex, their political history filled with nuances that took years to fully understand, their cultural practices built on assumptions that didn't translate easily from human frameworks. David studied constantly, learned Selenar language beyond basic diplomatic phrases, practiced court protocols until they became second nature. Ashira supported him through it, providing insight that his formal instructors couldn't. The unwritten rules, the political context that explained why certain laws existed, the cultural undercurrents that shaped Selenar thinking. They'd study together late into the night, formal lessons evolving into conversations that ranged across politics, philosophy, and personal histories. Their relationship deepened through the shared challenges. The initial attraction based on honesty had evolved into genuine partnership built on understanding, mutual respect, and the kind of compatibility that came from facing difficulties together. They learned each other's strengths and weaknesses, developed comfortable patterns, discovered they made each other better, Ashira more human, David more thoughtful. The human diplomatic corps remained nervous about the situation, but recognized they couldn't stop it. David's family back on Earth, receiving updates via long-range communication, were confused but trying to be supportive. His mother's messages oscillated between excitement about her son dating a queen and concern about the impossibility of the situation. The final test came when David had to appear before the High Council to demonstrate his competence and request formal approval as a candidate for royal consort. It was not a formality. Several council members remained opposed, and they tested him rigorously on Selenar law, history, and governance principles. David drew on everything he'd learned, but also on his own perspective as someone who understood both human and Selenar cultures. When questioned about whether he could truly serve Selenar interests despite being human, he responded honestly, "I can never be Selenar, but I can understand your values while bringing perspective from different frameworks. I'd argue that's an asset rather than a liability. The Empire benefits from leadership that bridges cultural differences rather than remaining isolated." The council debated for hours. Opinion was divided, and Selenar constitutional law required Queen Ashira to cast the deciding vote in case of a tie. She could force approval, but that would undermine the legitimacy of the process. Instead, she made a political argument that forced her opponents to either approve David or publicly embrace aristocratic prejudice. If this council rejects Captain Reeves after he's demonstrated actual competence and understanding of our governance, you're essentially saying that being born Selenar matters more than proving capability. That aristocratic birth is more important than merit. She looked at each council member. Is that truly the principle this body wishes to establish? It was a masterstroke that forced them into an impossible position. The council granted approval, though the vote wasn't unanimous. David was formally recognized as an acceptable candidate for royal consort. The official ceremony establishing their partnership was elaborate, combining Selenar traditions with accommodations for David's human background. It was witnessed by representatives from both their peoples, broadcast across the empire, and generated endless commentary about unprecedented cross-species royal partnerships. But the moment that mattered came afterward, when they were finally alone in the chambers they would now share. Ashira had removed her formal crown and elaborate regalia, standing before him in simpler clothing with her luminescent markings showing warm colors that indicated contentment and affection. When you first said, "I choose you," in front of my entire court, I was shocked, terrified, and beneath everything else thrilled. She moved closer. No one had seen me as anything other than a crown in years. You gave me permission to be both queen and person. I was terrified when I said it, David admitted. I knew I was violating protocols and probably destroying my career, but I couldn't let the moment pass without honesty. Your honesty forced me to be honest with myself about what I'd suppressed for years, about being lonely, about wanting connection, about the cost of power that requires constant distance from others. She took his hand. You've made me a better queen by reminding me to balance duty with humanity. You've made me a better person by teaching me that diplomacy and cultural understanding matter as much as tactical decisions. They stood together, two people who'd found each other because one had been brave enough to make an impossible request, and the other had been brave enough to consider that maybe impossible just meant difficult rather than wrong. The challenges ahead were real. Political opposition that wouldn't disappear, cultural differences they'd continue navigating, the reality that their relationship would always have public dimensions. But they'd proven they could handle those challenges together. Later, standing on the palace balcony overlooking the Selenar capital, Ashira reflected aloud. My advisors told me that maintaining personal relationships while ruling was a distraction I couldn't afford. You've proved them wrong. How so? Your presence makes me a better ruler. You remind me to see problems from different angles, to value perspective over protocol, to remember that my people benefit from a leader who understands both strength and vulnerability. Her markings glowed softly in the darkness. And yes, you make me happy, which apparently matters more than I'd let myself believe. David smiled. My commanding officers told me pursuing an alien queen was insane, that the barriers were insurmountable. They weren't wrong about the barriers. No, but some things are worth fighting through barriers to reach. He turned to look at her directly. You're worth it. That's remarkably romantic for a former naval officer. You're a good influence. They remained on the balcony as the Selenar moons rose, painting the capital in silver light. Two people from different worlds who'd built something unprecedented, because neither was willing to let possibility die just because it was complicated. Sometimes the most important moments began with someone saying something impossible. Sometimes the most significant partnerships formed when one person was brave enough to state what they wanted despite every reason to stay silent, and another person was brave enough to consider that maybe what seemed impossible was simply a challenge to overcome. They'd both chosen honesty over convenience, chosen each other over easier paths, and built something real because neither was willing to accept that different worlds meant incompatible lives. In her throne room months ago, David had said 4 words that changed everything. I choose you. And Queen Ashira, who'd spent 15 years being chosen for political advantage, for diplomatic necessity, for every reason except being wanted for herself, had been given permission to be chosen simply because someone saw the person beneath the crown. They'd proven that sometimes the greatest courage wasn't in battle or crisis, but in being honest about desire despite every complication that honesty would create. And sometimes the greatest reward for that courage was finding that the impossible was simply difficult, and difficult was something 2 determined people could overcome together. The story that began with a human's impossible choice had become a story about two people brave enough to choose each other, repeatedly, through every obstacle that tried to prevent it. And that, they both agreed, was worth every challenge they'd faced and would continue facing together.